Just moments ago, we're going to be talking about Gethsemane, and the text that I'm using for the lesson today is taken from John chapter 18, verses 4 through 8. John chapter 18, verses 4 through 8. Knowing everything that would happen to him, Jesus went out and asked, "Who is it that you're looking for?" They answered, "Jesus from Nazareth." "I am he," Jesus said. And then parenthetically, Judas, the one who turned against Jesus, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they moved back and fell to the ground. Jesus asked them again, "Who is it that you're looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus said. "So if you're looking for me, let the others go." My grandmother, this isn't exactly her house, but the garden looks very similar. My grandmother taught me a lesson very early on in my life, and that is you don't make a wreck of her garden. You can play ball in the front yard, you can have races around the acreage in the back, you can even build a fort in the many trees that she had on our property. But the garden, no, you leave it alone. And it wasn't a large garden, it was actually pretty small, about the size of a walk-in closet, actually. She didn't grow anything exotic except for maybe some mint that we'd use to soak in the summer tea that my grandmother would fix for us. She grew up in Arkansas, and there's just something about that Arkansas summer tea that is so refreshing. And so we'd pick mint out of the garden and put it in the tea. And though the vegetables that she grew in this garden were pretty tasty, she didn't need to really grow them. I mean, she could have very easily gone to the grocery store and purchased them. So, why did Nana even insist on having a garden? Well, it was pretty simple. Because my grandmother loved to see life. And her garden was this place that for her was full of life. A place where the buds are exploding during the springtime and the plants are pushing back the soil. A place where the turnips and the tulips and the tomatoes all called home. It was a place for my grandmother that was worthy of her love and her protection because flowers in her mind were fragile. Plants are precious. So she'd allow us to yank the weeds and scatter the critters, put up a fence even, or maybe even grow a hedge around the garden, even make a scarecrow if we wanted to. But she would say, "Randy, whatever you do, don't go trampling around in my garden." And I hate to think that I've got anything in common with Satan. But perhaps I do, because Satan learned that same lesson that my grandmother taught me. Don't mess with the garden, especially a garden that belongs to God. You see, the Bible, I think in some ways, is the story of actually two different gardens. We have the Garden of Eden, and then we have Gethsemane. In the first, Adam took his fall. In the second, Gethsemane, Jesus took a stand. In the first, God sought Adam, "Where are you?" And in the second, Jesus sought God. In Eden, Adam hid from God. But in Gethsemane, Jesus emerges from the tomb. In Eden, Satan led Adam to a tree that led to his death. From Gethsemane, Jesus went to a tree that led to our life. Satan was never, ever invited into the Garden of Eden. He didn't belong there. He wasn't wanted there. But instead, he slithered in like a snake into God's garden and infected God's children. And that's, church, all he's done ever since. In fact, my inquiry of myself this week and of you this week is, has Satan been allowed to enter a few of maybe your holy gardens? For instance, We call it holy matrimony, marriage, where sometimes an altar is used because it implies the very presence of God. Marriage was God's idea. The first wedding occurred in the first garden, but that doesn't make any difference to Satan. He snakes his way into every home with one desire, and that is to destroy a marriage. Sexual intimacy is a gift from God. Marriage is like a rose that you would pluck from a garden and then given by God and intended to be shared with your forever partner. But Satan mocks that kind of loyalty. He's the father of incest and abuse. He's the author of immorality. He's basically the pimp in the garden. And we give sacred oaths and we make solemn promises. We vow to be a good parent, a true companion, a loyal friend. But Satan's head turns when he hears those kinds of pledges. He smirks and says, well, we'll see about that. In God's eyes, a child is holy. The innocence of youth, the freshness of childhood, the joy of an infant. There was never, ever a moment in Jesus' life here on earth that he ever turned away a child. But there's never been a child that Satan doesn't despise. For instance, he killed babies in an attempt to kill Moses. He destroyed infants in an attempt to destroy the Christ. And his tactics have not changed. Millions of babies are still aborted, and an equal number of children are abused and trafficked. Jesus said of Satan, he was a murderer from the beginning. John chapter 8, verse 44. So the question is there even a realm that can remain untouched by Satan? Is there a place that can be unscarred by the sword that he brings? The church? Perhaps. The government? No, not likely. Children? We hope. Purity? We pray. And you or me, we are called to be holy. We were made to be holy. We were set apart to do his good work. We are prized flowers in God's garden. But isn't there at least one person among all of us who hasn't felt the foot of the intruder? What Satan did in Eden Church, he still does today. And for that reason, we need to know that what Jesus did in Gethsemane, he also still does today. He reclaims what's holy. He will not sit silent while Satan attempts to strip mine the sacred. At the right moment, Jesus stands and he speaks. And when he stands and speaks, Satan stumbles and is left utterly speechless. Because that's exactly what happened in Gethsemane. Now, John, the writer, tells us in chapter 18, verse 3, Judas came there with a group of soldiers and some guards from the leading priests and the Pharisees. And I've done a little study. And even a modicum of study reveals that Satan had masterminded what was essentially going to be a coup d'etat. He had enlisted the muscle of the significant force in this drama, which was the Romans and the Jews and the apostles. And if you start reading through this text, he had a group of soldiers. Now, the Greek word is spiria, and it has three possible meanings. It can signify a Roman cohort of 300 men. It can also refer to a cavalry, which totaled 1,900 soldiers, or it can describe a detachment known as a maniple, which contained 200 men. Now, I always had this impression in the Garden of Gethsemane that it was just a handful of soldiers that showed up and arrested Jesus. But I think I was wrong. Because if you take a look at the Greek word that is being used, it is anywhere from 1,900 to 300 to 200 at a minimum. So at a minimum, there were at least 200 soldiers dispatched to deal with a carpenter and his 11 buddies. 200 men. And also, don't forget that there were also some guards that were there as well. Now, these are the guys that were kind of the temple police. They were the guards associated with the Jews who were there to guard and protect the sacred elements of their faith. They were assigned to guard the holiest place during the busiest time of year, Passover. They were probably among Israel's finest soldiers. Maybe they were like yesterday's version of SEAL Team 6. And then there was Judas. He was one of the inner circle. Not only had Satan recruited the Romans and the Jews, he had actually infiltrated the cabinet. And hell, I'm thinking, must have been absolutely rejoicing. There was no way this time that Jesus could ever escape. Satan had sealed off every exit, and his lieutenants had anticipated every possible move, with the exception of one. Jesus didn't have any interest in trying to get away. He had no intent of trying to escape. He hadn't come to the garden to then retreat from it. What they found among the trees in the Garden of Gethsemane was no coward at all. What they found was a conqueror. And note the dialogue that ensues in this brief moment. Knowing everything that would happen to him, everything, Jesus went out and asked, "Who is it you are looking for?" They answered, "Jesus from Nazareth." "I am he," Jesus said. Then Judas, the one who turned against Jesus, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they moved back and fell to the ground. Jesus asked them again, "Who is it that you're looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you, I am he," Jesus said. "So if you're looking for me, let the others go." I think that's pretty remarkable. Because get the picture, church. They stand only a few feet from his face and they don't even recognize him. Not even Judas realized who stood before him. And I think there's some pretty deep truth to that observation if you're following along with my thinking. Apparently, seeing Jesus is more than a matter of seeing him with your eyes. It's a matter of seeing him with your heart. The enemy is next to Jesus and doesn't even realize it. And so he reveals himself, "I am he," which had great significance. Because remember when Moses said, "Well, I know you want me to deliver your people, but I don't know. Who am I going to tell who sent me?" Tell him the I am sent you. And now Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is saying, "I am he." His voice flicks the first domino, and then they all fall down. I mean, were the moment not so solemn like some of the songs we were singing this morning, it'd be almost comical, wouldn't it? Because these are the best soldiers that Rome has. These are the best guards that the Jewish temple guard can make and provide. And this was Satan's finest plan. And yet, one word from Jesus and they all fall down. I mean, it's kind of like the Roman guard becomes the Keystone Cops. Or the temple thugs, they turn into like Humpty Dumpty. 200 fighting men, and perhaps more, collapse into a noisy pile of shields and swords and lamps. And don't miss the symbolism here. When Jesus speaks, Satan falls. It doesn't matter who the evil one had recruited, apparently. It doesn't matter if he's infiltrated the government. It doesn't matter if he has seduced the temple. It doesn't matter if he's enlisted one of the original handpicked apostles. The best that Satan has, church, is like wax in the presence of Jesus Christ. And Jesus has to ask them again whom they seek. Who are you after? And when they answer that they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, did you hear what he said? He tells them, so if you're looking for me, let the others go. Did you catch that? Here's Jesus commanding them what to do. And for a Jew to instruct a Roman soldier what to do, that did not happen. A renegade that they thought Jesus is now directing the temple guard, that doesn't happen either. So we turn to the commander of this cohort, these 200 men, and we expect some sort of reply. I mean, we look at Judas, and we're waiting for his response too. We listen expecting someone in that crowd to say, hey, you're not the one in charge here, you Nazarene. We are. We'll take whoever we want. But not only are they silent, they're obedient because, as you may have noted, the apostles, the others, are what? Set free. You see, there's a lot of players that appear in this stage that we call Gethsemane. Judas and his betrayal, Peter and his sword, the disciples and their fears, the soldiers and their weapons. And though all these are crucial to the play, they are not instrumental. The encounter is not between Jesus and the soldiers. It is an encounter between God and Satan. Satan dares to enter yet another garden. But God stands and Satan doesn't have a prayer. So don't miss the message. John writes in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, our fight, church, is not against people on the earth, but against the rulers and the authorities and the powers of this world's darkness, against the spiritual powers of evil in the heavenly world. That's Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. My apologies. And then later on in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, he says, and the Son of God came for this purpose, to destroy the devil's work. So don't miss the message, but of equal importance, don't miss the promise either. Satan falls in the presence of Jesus Christ. One word from his lips, and the finest army in the world collapsed. Satan is silent in the proclamation of Christ. Not once did the enemy speak without Jesus' invitation. You see, before Christ, Satan has absolutely nothing to say. Satan is powerless against the protection of Christ. John chapter 18, verse 9 again, I have not lost any one of those who you gave me. You see, when Jesus says he'll keep you safe, he means it. Hell will have to go through him to get to you. Jesus is able to protect you. When he says he'll get you home, he'll get you home. So the question is, for me and perhaps for you, has Satan invaded a garden in your life? Has he profaned a part of your world? Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe it's your peace. Maybe it's your joy. I mean, has he taken away from you a rose that God gave you in the garden? If the answer is yes, then let Jesus reclaim it. Today, not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. This moment, because Satan has absolutely no authority over you. And if he has invaded a garden in your life, then invite Jesus to come in and reclaim it. Open the gate to God. He'll enter and he'll do for you what he did in Gethsemane. He will pray and he will protect. So why, church, don't you do that? And maybe sometimes it's because we don't know how. And the answer, like we discussed last week, and I told you, sometimes my default, more often than not, although this week was better, my default is to try and fix it all on my own before I ever get back to God. Today, let God reclaim that garden. And the way that you do that is you pray. And I'm not just going to preach, I'm going to pray with you. So let's pray right now. Precious Father, we here at Oak Hill praise your holy name. And you have reclaimed so much in our lives, God. We were lost and you found us. We were confused and you guided us. We had nothing to offer. But still, God, you loved us. We need your help, God. There's parts in our life that need your touch. Satan is battling for this garden that's in my heart, and don't let him win. Drive him out. He's a liar, and he has been since the very beginning. Please, God, defeat him. And we will give you the glory. And Father, in particular, here is an area where I need your strength. And church, this is the place where I step out and leave you alone in your garden to talk to God about that area in your life where you need specifically his help. A place where you and God can meet and talk over the details of your particular issue. You see, we can come to the garden collectively as a church, but we can also come to the garden alone with God and ask him to protect us and to help us. What we saw, church, in the battle of the Garden of Gethsemane was not a traitor and a few guys taking Jesus away. It was a battle for men's hearts that Jesus prayed and wept for you and for me. And the great news is he overcame. So church, this week, if there is a garden in your life and somebody is trampling on your garden, you can be like my Nana and say, you don't trample my garden. And if there's a spiritual part of that garden in your heart, Elliot, can you advance to the next slide? As you've noticed, all the songs that we've been singing today were about Gethsemane. And again, this is not a happy, peppy song, like come to Jesus today kind of thing. It's meant for you to sing, I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses. And as you sing this song, church, if you know the words, close your eyes and sing. If you don't know the words, read them, but just don't read the words. Sing the words. Feel the words. And perhaps own those words to encourage you this moment and then moving forward this week to come to Gethsemane. Let's stand and let's sing.